Maybe 15 years ago, my friend Chris and I got talking about faith, about religion. Chris had just written a really weighty theological book, a book that I confess I found impenetrable. Chris has since died, and Chris, if you are listening from the next place, I apologize for just pretending to read your book. And because the book was full of multisyllabic words and sentences in search of a period, I had this fear that when we started talking about religion and faith, that I was going to be similarly stuck, unable to follow him. But Chris didn't say anything complicated at all. He said faith, religion, and to be clear, we were talking about healthy expressions of faith, not destructive or cruel ones. Faith or religion is made up of three things: healing, belonging, and meaning. And in the 15 years since then, I've been thinking about Chris's three words a lot. I would like to think with you a little bit about them on this Easter morning. All three of them overlap. Healing is the assurance that there is new life and possibility and joy and hope coming for us, notwithstanding suffering and hardship and unfairness and grief. Now, let's notice in particular that word notwithstanding. This good news, freedom and joy and possibility and hope, they're not coming instead of suffering or grief or hardship or other things. They're coming after it and in spite of it. The women come to the tomb bright and early on the first day of the week on Sunday. And they have just witnessed a handful of days beforehand Jesus' awful death. The men fled in fear, but the women remained. They stood at the foot of the cross as Jesus suffered and died. And this morning, they are coming to his tomb carrying jars full of ointment in order to prepare his body. They're carrying jars full of ointment and grief to the tomb. In contemporary and 21st century language, we would say they're coming to the tomb carrying trauma with them. And it is in this experience of deep grief and loss, this experience of trauma, that the women encounter this angel who says to them, "Don't be afraid," because after the cross, who would not be afraid? And then later on, they meet Jesus, who says the same thing to them: "Do not be afraid." And in encountering the risen Lord, Mary and the other women find this reservoir of healing that allows them to live fully even as their grief and loss and suffering remains. They're invited through resurrection into fullness of life. I don't know about you, but this experience of finding a reservoir of healing, even in grief, is very congruent with my own experience, things that have happened to me and things that I have witnessed in others. The thing that I fear, perhaps the thing that I fear most, happens. And it turns out that God gives me and gives others a capacity to respond to it, even within that awful thing, to live fully. I remember when my friend Ron was dying and I went to see him. There's someone else who was in that room when Ron was dying here this morning. I went to see him. It was maybe 3 days before his death. And Ron saw me come in the door and he said, "Everything is great." He had found, even in his dying, this reservoir of holy healing. Ron then said to me, "Would you mind giving me a kiss?" And he became the first and last person I've kissed during a pastoral visit. Don't tell the bishop. Similarly, many people who have traveled, particularly to other countries, have had the experience of meeting someone living in poverty, sometimes in deep poverty, and being surprised and humbled by how joyful and generous these folks are. This person has so much less than I do, and somehow they have so much more. These folks have found a reservoir of holy healing. And I think in my own life of wilderness moments, of being laid off from jobs, of being dumped by friends, of enduring cruelties, these were awful experiences, and I am, in a funny way, grateful for them. Not because they had silver linings, they didn't. Not because there were some good things about getting dumped by friends, there weren't. But because if I know anything about compassion or empathy, it's because of these experiences, and in them I discovered a reservoir of holy healing and was able to live fully. Throughout Jesus' earthly ministry, he heals people, and after the resurrection, he heals us still. Belonging. Belonging is the promise that God calls you by name and invites you to follow. In the Gospel of Luke, it says that Mary Magdalene had demons cast out of her by Jesus. And later on in that same gospel, it says that Mary provided a great deal of the financial support that made Jesus' ministry possible. Nowhere in any of the gospels, by the way, does it say that Mary was a prostitute. That story surfaces, as near as we can figure, for the first time in the 6th century, some 500 years after her life. That is a made-up thing. And well, we can imagine, as someone who'd had demons cast out of her and someone who is writing big checks to make Jesus' ministry possible, that these things define Mary socially. And my thinking here is indebted heavily to the contemporary preacher Nadia Bolz-Weber. We can well imagine that people look at Mary and say, "Hey, aren't you the demon lady?" Or they look at her role within Jesus and his friends and say, "Aren't you the checkbook lady?" But Jesus never calls Mary any of these things. Jesus calls her by her name, by the name that she wants, by the name that she has chosen. In the Gospel of John, which we heard last night, Mary comes to the tomb and she sees the risen Jesus and mistakes him for the gardener. And she does not recognize Jesus until he calls her by name, until he says Mary. And that calling by name is what sets her free and invites her into belonging. My friend Sylvia has been a priest for a long time, and she said that when there's conflict at her parish, conflict over whether the hymns are too fast or too slow, or whether the grass has been cut recently enough, or the color of the paint on the walls. We don't have any conflict like that, by the way, here at Grace. If there's any of you looking for a church, Grace is perfect and conflict-free. Sylvia says that when those things surface, she's learned across the years that they are almost always placeholders for an ancient and pernicious fear, which is, I'm afraid I don't really belong. And she said, as a consequence, when someone says the paint is the wrong color or the hymn is, it's so slow, it's like a dirge, she will call them by name and say, you belong here. And often that is enough, often with that holy assurance in hand. Remember Mr. Rogers, that great 20th century saint, I like you just the way you are. With that assurance in hand, suddenly the length of the grass doesn't seem that important. If you have ever been called by a name that you didn't choose and you didn't want, and if you've been to middle school or been on the internet, I suspect you have. I suspect that I am not the only loser, dweeb, or dork in this room. Then you know the power of being called by your true name, by the name of your heart, by the name that you want for yourself. Jesus calls you by your name and says you belong here. And then Jesus invites you to follow. Last of all, the third of Chris's categories, meaning. And so healed and invited into belonging by the risen Christ, the women go forth and they proclaim the gospel. They're the first preachers of the gospel. They preach it to the men and in turn to all sorts of other people. And in so doing, they change the world and change themselves. They participate in this deep meaning. Many of the people to whom they preach are living with grinding poverty. They're living under occupation. There are the soldiers of another country marching through their land. And this is miles before 21st century medicine or sewer systems. And so illness and death are never far away. There are many, many tribulations that these people endure. And within that, they find the possibility, the joy, the freedom, the agency that comes of doing meaningful work. They find this holy spring in their step as a consequence of saying yes to meaning. I will invite you to cast your mind back to a time when you have engaged in an act of meaningful service. Maybe that is a time when you have served in a soup kitchen or here at Grace, served at the Sunday meal. Maybe it is a time when you have driven a neighbor to a hospital appointment or some other important thing. Maybe it's a time when you've just lent an ear to someone who is lonely. And my hunch is that when you said yes to doing this thing, you imagined that you were mostly doing it for someone else. I'm going to serve at the soup kitchen because there are people who are hungry. That's a fairly utilitarian explanation, and that's a good reason to go to the soup kitchen. But here's my suspicion. My suspicion or hunch is that at some point you said to yourself, I think I might be getting more out of this than the people whom I am feeding. I thought I was here to feed others, and the meaning that I am encountering in this act of service is transforming me and setting me free and inviting me into full life. That old Saint Irenaeus said God's glory is the human being fully alive, and in service we find that full aliveness. Occasionally, you'll encounter someone who wants to explain to you what church is for. And perhaps you've heard an explanation like this. Someone will say, the point of church is to get into heaven. And friends, that's not the point of church. That's emphatically not the point of church. If it turns out that the anti-theists are right and what awaits us at the end of our lives is oblivion, then I will still do this practice. Because I get to hang out with you, all of these people whom I love. I get to say yes to the meaning that Jesus offers us. I get to participate in service, in joy. I get to invite the kingdom near in my own small way with you. That is the purpose of church, is to invite the kingdom near. It is to invite God's will into the world. And in case that sounds surprising or unexpected or pseudo-heretical, let us note that this claim that we're here to do this work here and now is hiding in plain sight in something that we say every Sunday and perhaps every day. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done. Where? On earth as it is in heaven. The point of church is not to get to some magical place later, although I do trust in the resurrection. It is to do God's will right now. And the good news in doing God's will is saying yes to meaning, invites us into joy. God has called us in Jeremiah. God says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Elsewhere in Jeremiah, in that strange and wonderful and beautiful book, it says, I have plans for you, plans that you may have hope and thrive. And because God calls us, there's an invitation, a calling. Here's a dangerous and out-of-fashion word, perhaps a duty for us to say yes and participate. Doing these things, engaging in acts of service to creation, to neighbor, to God, this is the antidote to despair. Get off your darn phone and go out and do stuff. This is where you will find you are fully alive in service. We don't have the problems that Mary Magdalene and her friends and the other disciples had. I am grateful we don't live under occupation. I am grateful to know where my next meal is coming from. I'm grateful that penicillin and an effective sewer system exists. But gosh, we've got our own problems, don't we? Let us remember the first disciples who did not succumb to despair, but who chose meaning, and in so doing, changed the world. Chris, all these years later, I still haven't read your book, and I may never. But I think about your 3 words all the time. I think about this calling or vocation into healing, into belonging, into meaning. 3 words that are maybe a synonym for another word. That word being resurrection. Happy Easter.